All right, so let's look at, so we were seeing Edith Hamilton and her introduction in the book. And basically, right, like, the background that I mentioned too, did anybody mention who's the philosopher in the background? This, that the state of nature is perfect happiness and everyone's nice and it's utopia. And you just take the fruit from the tree and Rousseau, exactly. And what is he really making it like there in terms of, exactly. So he's basically saying the state of nature is like the Garden of Eden. So, and before or after the fall? Before. So basically what's he denying?
The fall.
Original sin. And remember I pointed that out. That's why in the spring, when you do modern philosophy, you typically talk about Luther because Luther said, oh, original sin, we're totally corrupt. He overemphasized it. If he had never overemphasized it so much, probably no one would have ever just completely rejected it. But in the face of that, where we're utterly corrupt in everything we do, he's like, oh no, we're actually we're not, there's no original sin at all. We were just, everything would be fine. But the evil is private property, and the evil is civilization. So if you hear about, like, back in the 60s, they would chant, like, hey, Western civ has got to go, like, the basically the kind of hatred of Western civilization that we think of that as starting in the 60s as a cultural phenomenon, but really it goes back 200 years to Rousseau, who was already saying that Western Christian civilization is what makes people bad, which is pretty radical. And then in the postmodern period, that just becomes the norm. Like, it's not just Rousseau saying that; it's all of them, like Foucault and. So anyway, so she's kind of criticizing Rousseau here because when you talk about like myths and things like that, a lot of that would be called anthropologists. And she points out the anthropologists don't really talk much about Greek myths because it really is, it's already civilization. And of course she's viewing it in a positive way, right? She's viewing Western civilization in a positive way, insofar as, right, the Greeks and Romans had contributions to make. Okay, so then she goes into the romantic bubble after talking about that. And by the way, and once again, right, in terms of actual history and fact, most primitive societies are extremely violent, and there's 2 books on that. There's a book called War Before Civilization. It's in my syllabus in the nature class. In the nature class, I give you a whole really long bibliography. I give you like 100 books. That just because I could either give you like 100 books or give you like 3. So in that one, I just decided to give you 100. And so there's a book called War Before Civilization. It's kind of funny because I could just tell the person mentions Aquinas, so the person who wrote it must be Catholic. And he's showing like how, that's the norm. Now, there are rare exceptions. I think the Pueblo Indians were comparatively peaceful. They lived in little houses, like out in Arizona or something. But that's the exception to the rule. The Iroquois is much more the norm. Like the Iroquois genocide, right? So it doesn't, the whole like narrative, civilization leads to Hitler, it leads to genocide. Well, people will say, whereas, right, in a primitive state, like they would never do something like that. Well, that's just false. Because the Iroquois were committing genocide, right? And it took them longer because they didn't have technology, but they were doing the exact same thing, right? So that's, anyway, when you talk about the romantic bubble, that's important to keep in mind, Okay. Or also, I'll be in the cafeteria at 11:30. Okay, so then she goes on to the mythology of the Greeks, right? It is puzzling in the Greek myths, right? So if the Aztecs are performing human sacrifice, if you know anything about the Aztecs, you know that was just their religion revolved around that. But it's kind of surprising to see that in the Greeks. You'd think they were more civilized, and as she's pointing out, there was still that remnant in the early period, which Homer refers to. But by the classical period, which is like 500 BC, that was no longer practiced. Okay, we do not know when on page 3. Jake, did you read that? I think Robert read to you. So page 3, the second paragraph.
We do not know when these stories were first told in their present shape, but whenever it was, primitive life had been left far behind. The myths, as we have them, are the creation of great poets. The first written record of Greece is the Iliad. Greek mythology begins with Homer, generally believed to be not earlier than 1,000 years before Christ. The Iliad is or contains the oldest Greek literature. and it is within, and it is written in a rich and subtle and beautiful language which must have had behind it centuries where men were striving to express themselves with clarity and beauty, an indisputable proof of civilization. The tales of Greek mythology do not throw any clear light upon what early mankind was like. They do throw an abundance of light upon what early Greeks were like, a matter, it would seem, of more importance to us, who are their descendants intellectually, artistically, and politically too. Nothing we learn about them is alien to ourselves.
So once again, this is where, I mean, the thing about studying philosophy is it helps you understand everything. It certainly helps you understand theology because, right, philosophy is the handmaid of theology. But it helps you understand the sciences as well. And all, so the background here is Rousseau influenced anthropology, that when they're talking about myths, right, they're looking at primitive civilizations and trying to present them as these utopias. And she's saying, like, right, against that, you know, that really as you move forward to civilization, life improves, right? So in the spring, when I do Rousseau, I give you guys a text from the Jesuit relations, and he talks about what it was like, because they live with the Iroquois. It's really quite amazing. I mean, it's only by the grace of God. And that's where he talks about, you know, half the tribe starved to death, and he was eating his shoe leather, and he was eating the barks off the trees, and he was freezing, and I mean, it's really incredible what this poor Jesuit endured. He was blinded by the smoke in the tent, so that he couldn't see for days. His eyes watered the whole winter. I mean, he had lice and vermin all over him. It just goes on and on and on. And that's pre-civilized humans, right? It's not this like utopian Garden of Eden where, you know, you just, right? It's like a Disney movie or something. Right? No, like the birds are singing and like talking to you. No, like that's the Jesuit talking about what it's actually like. But ever since Rousseau, that narrative is so powerful and pervasive, right? The narrative of the primitive is really this utopia. It's perfect. It's happy. Which is not to say that there weren't happy moments if you're a Pueblo Indian, because you're not always being hunted down by your enemies, right? I'm sure there are. But the point is that civilization is moving forward, right? To having like a written language and history, all these things. So that's why that's the backdrop, because you can be like, who cares about primitive? This is a book about the Greek myths. Well, because the whole Rousseauian message is that the primitive is superior. You could even give that a name. You could call it primitivism. And there's a strain of that, even though we're not going to do, the Rousseau doesn't come until the spring. But Timothy Treadwell is a bit influenced by that. When you watch Grizzly Man, right, he wants to be out there with the bears, get away from society. Society is corrupt. It's almost like, remember how Luther said that human nature is totally corrupt? Rousseau was saying Western civilization is totally corrupt. That would be a good way to think of it, right? Everything that human nature does for Luther is evil. For Rousseau, everything Western civilization does is evil on some level, or at least for the more radical ecologists. It's called ecologism now in the 20th century, right? That we should just kind of return to nature. Even technology is bad. There's a whole, whole literature on that kind of thing. So what she's saying, on the other hand, is that, right, we're the descendants of the Greeks. As I said, the two pillars of Western civilization, I don't know if it's written on the board, I think you probably remember, are, right, the Athens and Jerusalem, right, the Greeks and Romans, and then the Judeo-Christian tradition. So, let's keep reading.
People often speak of the Greek miracle. What the phrase ties to express is the new birth of the world with the awakening of Greece. Old things are passed away. Behold, all things are become new. Something like that happened in Greece.
Right. So it's true, just all these things we take for granted. And this is going to be the Pre-Socratics book as well, right? The beginning of not just philosophy, but science as we conceive it goes back to ancient Greeks. We'll see that with the Pre-Socratics, right? Like the first map makers, all kinds of firsts that they managed to achieve. Let's skip to the next. She says, right, mankind became the center of the universe. This is a revolution. Human beings counted for little before that. In Greece, man first realized what mankind was. not in a bad sense of being self-centered, like secular humanism, where we're denying God and saying we're everything. Not in that sense, because obviously they think there's gods, even if they don't understand it correctly. But in the sense that, for the Celts, like, hey, right, we need good crops. Who's going to get sacrificed this time? Well, let's go to battle, capture some people, and sacrifice them. Or the Aztecs. We need the sun to keep rising. All right, this year, what is it going to be? 10,000. I think the year before the Spanish got there, they sacrificed 40,000 people. There's a movie, actually, not for the faint of heart. But that's exactly what they did. They tore their hearts. And yet, when I went to Mexico City, there's a big mural in the government building that represents the Christian missionaries as like devils, and the Aztecs as this glorious civilization. And the whole narrative there is that so see how Rousseau, right? Christian civilization is evil, it's corrupt. Is that these they make the Franciscans and Dominicans look like monsters. I'm just telling you this. If you ever go to Mexico City, I mean, you can look it up online nowadays, right? I'm sure you can see the mural. Like they're torturing the Indians and all this, and the Aztecs had this glorious civilization that had been lost. Well, they killed people by the tens of thousands. Their whole society revolved around that, if you ever get to read about the Aztecs. And that's what, of course, Our Lady of Guadalupe, right, put a stop to. There's a book on that by Warren Carroll. Anybody? I think it's called like Our Lady of Guadalupe and the Conquest of Darkness, something like that.
I can't. I read it.
Warren Carroll, on the note of, I don't give you I don't think I gave you too much of a bibliography, but I think I did mention him in the bibliography in this class. So anyway, he has a book. To my mind, he's like the premier Catholic historian of the second half of the 20th century. And it's just often a photographic negative of secular history, right? Or, I don't know, photographic negative of what you see on that mural, right? Here's the glorious Aztecs who had, astronomy and these huge temples, right? It was so wonderful, right? The feathered serpent and everything. And then here come these Christians ruining everything. That's the very clear message. And the reality is the exact opposite, right? If you watch Apocalypto, right? They tore their hearts out, and they ripped their hearts out and threw the bodies down the stairs. Right? That's what those big glorious temples were for. And they're very steep stairs. If you ever get to go to Mexico, the stairs are like almost impossible to walk up. You be careful, I don't know when you guys get hurt. I have kids, so but seriously, we don't want seminaries breaking their legs and walking up a big temple. But yes, I mean, and there's a whole literature on that. But I think people raising their hand.
Do they also deny the idea that tons of Native Americans aided the Christians? Like, that happened as well, right? A lot of the native population revolted against the Aztecs.
They hated the Aztecs. Yeah, exactly. No, exactly. That's the key thing, is that the Aztecs were hated by the local tribes because they were the ones getting sacrificed. So there was, they staged these mock wars. The only purpose of the mock wars was to get people for the slaughter, for the sacrifice. So, yeah, the Aztecs are definitely a low point in human behavior, even in all of human history. I mean, I don't know anywhere else where it reached quite that level and that yearly kind of thing. But then, of course, that's why it puts Our Lady of Guadalupe in a special light. But then you see that still, like something about Mexico, like the devil, where there's the Blessed Mother's there, the devil's going to be there. I could give you examples of that, but this is a good example, right? Here's the Blessed Mother of Guadalupe, incredible Tilma, if you guys know that whole story. And then you have the mural of, depicting things that way. Huh?
As we've been belaboring the point for a while,
Okay.
I spent a lot of time in the academy in anthropology and sociology.
Okay.
And they do a lot of writing recognizing such violence and atrocities and degradation of humanity.
Okay,
But at
good.
the same time, there's a huge blind spot. Like, they recognize that the violence exists, but there's like an ideological blind spot in identifying themselves as primitivists or,
Okay.
So how
So
wide is their blind
that's
spot?
progress then, yeah, that's progress, because things may have changed in the last 30, 40 years, so they may have moved away from the Rousseauian. And oftentimes there is progress in the humanities. Eventually people are like, look, that book, War Before Civilization, the way they try to get around the evidence of violence is really pretty, it just doesn't make sense. Like, there's all these bodies, like, well, it must not have been from a war. Well, it's obvious that it was from a war because they have the damage that you have in the skeletons. So I'm happy to hear if they've made progress, and then, so you're saying,
No.
so now they're willing to move beyond the Rousseauian thing and say that there was violence in primitive situations, and then you're saying, there,
No, so-
what's the question you're asking beyond that?
Yeah, well, the question was, there's a recognition that violence had occurred, but there seems to be a blind spot, and they still ascribe to primitivism as life was good before civilization. But my question is, why is there an ideological or a cognitive blind spot, cognitive dissonance, recognizing that this violence actually is associated with a primitive way of life? Like, I don't understand how they
So
have these.
I guess what I would say there is that, right, they're willing to say, even though the book War Before Civilization wasn't famous, you know, people are willing to be self-critical to some point. And so they'll say, like, you know, yeah, actually, no, there was violence, but they're still Rousseauian in the sense that they don't, even though they'll admit the fact of the violence, they don't really want to go into the reason why. Because the reason why would take you into human nature, and the fact that human nature has bad inclinations. So even if they're willing to admit the fact of it, which is certainly progress and a step in the right direction, they still are Rousseauian in the sense of being like, well, they can't admit that, you know, we're very... Now, on the other hand, remember, the two opposites there are, you know, talking about, right, primitivism, it's Rousseau versus Hobbes. So the other thing is that they're more Hobbesian, right? There's two modern extremes here. One, it was all primitive utopia. The state of nature is purely innocent. And for him, he said, you know, life in a state of nature is nasty, brutish, and short. Which is, I'll give him credit. I mean, he's not denying what was going on with like the Iroquois, right? Which once again, not everyone was the Iroquois. They were exceptionally cruel. So you could also have the Hobbesian thing where you're like, okay, sure, but the thing is, we're still not actually getting it. Both of these are extremes, right, regarding human nature. So the real question is there just a state of nature? There's two questions. Is there just a state of nature, right? Or is there also human nature, right? Because for both of these, they agree we can talk about the state of nature. But for both of them, right, there's no such thing as human nature because they're nominalists. All the moderns don't accept human nature, at least in a strong sense of the term. And so then even if you're a Hobbesian, they're not going to kind of move beyond it to, examining human nature. I mean, really what it is, so in the spring, the philosophy of science class is going to kind of address some of these. The underlying problem is it's the background philosophy, right, that they're using is inadequate. I mean, that's the short kind of answer to why, as you said, they accept the primitivism, but they can't really see, they can't go beyond that. Because, yeah, that's the short answer.
Thank you.
I know it doesn't answer that much at this point. Okay, so, all right, so the point there though is just that in a secular society, there's a tendency to, kind of, these are the things that happen. These are the narratives that are kind of take place. Okay, so to wrap up on the primitive thing. So basically, there's two kinds of tradition, and this is why kind of the Greeks are important. So we're all familiar with sacred tradition, right? So sacred tradition, you could think of that as like a stream that's completely pure, right? Remember I was saying, right, if Jesus said it, then you know that it's true. The Bible is, the Old Testament, we know that's divine revelation with the capital R, right? So we know that we can trust it. I mean, it might take some analysis and so on, but especially the New Testament, but even the Old Testament, right? We know that we can rely on it. It's the revelation, it's the Word of God. Then there's another, this is from somebody, John Senior, who is kind of trying to make this point. So there's another thing called primordial traditions, because the question would be like, well, what's the point even, who cares about the ancient Greeks, right? They're one of 100 different civilizations, right? They have their myths, there's 1,000 other myths, what's the big deal? And this is where the idea of primordial tradition comes in, that it's not totally pure, right? But it still has great value. And so the example would be like Homer, right? So Homer, I mean, sure, the Greeks, they're not Christian, that's for sure, right? They can be very very immoral and so on. But on the other hand, there is like certain things like justice, right? There's a sense of hubris is bad. Hubris means kind of like pride is a bad thing, right? And so that's what you could call, I think it's helpful to call it primordial tradition, right? So this is, think about it, right? Homer's been around for thousands of years. It's also what survived, right? Sometimes the best things do survive. Okay, why has Homer been preserved? Because, right, there is a lot of value there. And, so that's really what kind of the interest of looking at the Greek myths, even before you get to the pre-Socratics. Okay? So let's look at, let's keep reading on the Greek gods, page 5. Who's next? I think it's you then.
Okay. The Greeks made their gods in their own image. That had not entered the mind of man before. Until then, gods had no semblance of reality. They were unlike all living things. In Egypt, a towering colossus, immobile, beyond the power of the imagination to endow with movement, as fixed in the stone as the tremendous temple columns, a representation of human shape deliberately made unhuman, or a rigid figure, a woman with a cat's head suggesting inflexible, inhuman cruelty, or a monstrous, mysterious sphinx, aloof from all that lives. In Mesopotamia, bas-reliefs of bestial shapes unlike any beast ever known, men with birds' heads and lions with bulls' heads, and both with eagles' wings, creations of artists who were intent upon producing something never seen except in their own minds, the very consummation of unreality.
These and their like were what the pre-Greek world worshipped. One need only place beside them in imagination any Greek statue of a god, so normal and natural with all its beauty, to perceive what a new idea had come into the world. With its coming, the universe became rational.
Okay. All right, let's go to page 7. So we don't have to read all this. That is the miracle, Christian?
That is the miracle of Greek mythology, a humanized world. Men freed from the paralyzing fear of an omnipotent unknown. The terrifying incomprehensibilities which were worshipped elsewhere, and the fearsome spirits with which earth, air, and sea swarmed, were banned from Greece. It may seem odd to say that the men who made the myths disliked the irrational and had a love for facts. But it's true, no matter how wildly fantastic some of the stories are. Anyone who reads them with attention discovers that even the most nonsensical take place in a world which is essentially rational and matter of fact.
Okay. Why don't we skip to the next paragraph?
The terrifying irrational has no place in classical mythology. Magic, so powerful in the world before and after Greece, is almost non-existent. There were no men and only 2 women with dreadful supernatural powers.
Right. So often in a primitive situation, like not just in America but in general, like in northern Japan, shamanism is what they'll have. They'll have a shaman or a witch doctor. And when the Jesuits came to America, right, they said that the witch doctor was speaking for the devil, right? St. Isaac Job says that the witch doctor was possessed. Same thing with the Aztecs. So it really is, if you read the early accounts of the Spaniards who went there, he said that the devil, the priests who were committing the slaughtering all the people were possessed. And there were like preternatural occurrences so like voices were coming from the idols. Well, that's called, so when a demonic activity is called preternatural, that's a specific term that we use. You could say supernatural, but really, what God does is supernatural. We want to distinguish something that we can't explain that's done by a demon as opposed to God. Right, that's kind of, yeah. So when she's talking about this, I mean, in terms of Catholicism, right, this is true. Or like in Africa, right, sometimes in Africa they'll have witch doctors and then it'll turn out like people get possessed, right? So, see what I mean? Even though it's easy to focus on all the negatives about ancient Greeks, they had come a long way from, what often happened in the primitive state. Okay?
The demoniac wizards and the hideous old witches who haunted Europe and America up to quite recent years play no part at all in the stories.
Okay, so like I said, if you read the Jesuit Relations or even the account of some of the accounts about the Spaniards who first encountered the Aztec civilization. Okay, why don't you skip to the bottom, the last sentence, the early Greek.
The Greeks were not afraid of the dead, the piteous dead, the Odyssey calls them.
Okay, right. Right, as opposed to having ghosts.
The world of Greek mythology was not a place of terror for the human spirit. It is true that the gods were disconcertingly incalculable. One could never tell where Zeus's thunderbolt would strike. Nevertheless, the whole divine company, with a very few and for the most part not important exceptions, were entrancingly beautiful with a human beauty, and nothing humanly beautiful is really terrifying. The early Greek mythologists transformed a world full of fear into a world full of beauty.
Okay.
This bright picture has its dark spots. The change came about slowly, it was never quite completed. The gods became human. The gods become human were for a long time a slight improvement upon their worshippers. They were incomparably lovely and more powerful, and they were of course immortal. But they often acted in a way no decent man or woman would. In the Iliad, Hector, a nobler, by far the aim of the heavenly beings, and Aphrodite, infinitely be prepared to Athena or Aphrodite. Hera from the first.
So just for the context, so Hector is the another very striking thing. So she's focusing on comparing them more to like primitivism. That's because of the context, as I mentioned, with kind of Rousseauian anthropology at the time. But you could also compare it to other civilizations, right? And so one thing that's very striking about the Iliad, so before the Iliad, typically there's chronicles, right? There's just not that much written from the ancient world. And the chronicles, like if you read the chronicles of the Assyrians, they're written from the perspective of the victors, right? So, the Assyrians crushed this enemy. The Assyrians in scripture, right? They're notorious for being, violent. So like I said, right, that's unfortunately often how things are. And, right, there's just chronicles of how they did this or did that. Like it's for us, obviously the Jews are very important, right? But if you look at Egyptian records, the Jews, they're not really mentioned much, if at all. So they're not even really paying attention to them, right? Or they're at war with them, and they're talking about conquering them, right? The Egyptian records don't talk about Pharaoh losing a battle, right? Because that would make him look bad. It serves a political purpose, right? The religion serves a political purpose, right? So what's there's very striking things about Homer. And this is, once again, the fathers of the church, I don't think it's not just the philosophers that are preparation for the gospel. In a sense, it's also just the Greek civilization. So the amazing thing about Homer is he actually has sympathy for the enemy, right? The Trojans are the enemies of the Greek, and yet he actually presents them almost more sympathetically. Like, really, Hector is kind of more sympathetic than Achilles. Achilles is kind of a little bit arrogant, and then he's like sulking in his tent, and people are getting killed because he's sulking in his tent because they're bickering over a concubine. Like, meanwhile, Hector is like married, he has a wife, he has kids. You see what I mean? So that's, to my knowledge, that's the first time that ever happened in literature. I haven't read everything from the ancient world, but That's the first time that happened, of showing the enemy as actually completely sympathetic. And even sometimes the Greeks seem worse than the Trojans. Well, that's just not how it really worked up until that point. So Andromache is Hector's wife, and she's saying it's true. Like Athena and Aphrodite can seem kind of childish, selfish. Once again, the gods are always bickering with each other. And then Andromache, the humans in Homer seem, sometimes they seem more noble, right? So that's the kind of positive, maybe humanism, you could say, of some of the Greek texts, huh?
Like the protagonist in the ancient Greek text seemed to be virtue itself, regardless of the physical protagonist or antagonist in the story. Like Homer's attempting to show that virtue is universal.
Right. So like Penelope is another example. For 20 years, her husband is gone, and she's faithful to him. She has all these suitors. There's a movie called The Return, if you want to watch it, but it's just beware because it's R-rated, unfortunately. I wish they didn't do that, just to make it PG-13. You have to maybe shut your eyes a couple times, or hit the fast forward or whatever. But it's called The Return. It's about Odysseus. It's just Odysseus from the time he gets back till the end. And she's like in the ancient Greek civilization, she was the model of the virtue of chastity, right? That even though it seemed like her husband was dead, she refused to believe that. So yes, there are exactly examples of virtue, not just the king, the chronicler talking about the king, slaying his enemies, or even like the first literature is, Babylonians, and it's a hero who's conquering all these monsters, right? But he's more, exactly, good, Gilgamesh, thank you. But, he's not, it's not like Homer where there's all this kind of, you're seeing within the characters. Okay, who was reading?
Hera from first to last is a goddess on a very low level of humanity. Almost every one of the radiant divinities could act cruelly or contemptibly. A very limited sense of right and wrong prevailed in Homer's heaven for a long time after.
So she is being balanced. The first couple pages, it does seem like she's painting it kind of more brightly than it really is, compared to Christianity, for example. But then she admits she's not saying that that they have a very high sense of right and wrong. It's very limited, but still compared to the Assyrians or the Babylonians or even the Egyptians, right? It's qualitatively different. Because it's true that any civilization, right? The Egyptian civilization, of course, had great accomplishments, but we know from Scripture, right? I don't think the Egyptians ever mentioned it, but right, throwing all the babies into the river and things. So, okay. Let's see. So why don't we look at the definition sheet for a minute? So this is the proto-philosophical thing, also called the primordial tradition, right? That there's really a lot to be, you can get a lot out of reading Homer, because it's 3,000 years old, and it's a reason it survived all that time. It's the classical sources do have a lot of value to them for our primordial tradition. Who's next?
Reading anthropomorphism.
Yep.
Anthropomorphism is attributing human characteristics to divinities, exempli gratia, lying and stealing, and be able to provide examples from mythology.
So just give an example or two, but I mean, it's really, they're always acting anthropomorphic, right? I mean, they're basically just like acting like humans on a grander scale, humans who are more powerful, but not omnipotent, not omniscient. Yep.
So I might have been overthinking this when I was trying to think of examples then.
Okay.
Right. So is everything that they're doing, since they're not omniscient, like everything that's attributing them as doing, could that be an example of that?
I mean, typically it's more things like, they're having emotions, right? Their emotional reactions.
Do you want like super specific examples, or could we do how there was two sides of gods bickering during the Trojan War?
That's fine. Okay. Yeah, it doesn't necessarily have to be that specific, but it could be specific. Yeah. Yeah.
Could it be something as generic as like Zeus trying to run around and
Yeah, that's fine. Exactly. you don't have to remember all the names, but when you read it, you can't help noticing. You must have, it's just, it must have been done times, right? You don't have to give the name of so and so and such and such. Yeah. If it were classic class, you would, but it's not. Okay. Brian, do you want to read next? The lecture notes on Homer, number 1.
Lecture notes on Homer. The Iliad, the Trojan War's 9th year. Achilles versus Hector. Presents an ethic of honor and shame. Raises the problem of suffering, gods and fate as explanations for human events.
Right. So, I mean, obviously, there's all kinds of things we could say about this, but as I mentioned before, it's an honor-shame ethic. It's not yet the Socratic virtue ethics, where Socrates says you should do what's right even if no one knows about it. That's basically a new idea. The typical attitude was, I want to do what's honorable and not do what's shameful. So it's based on what society thinks is okay. So if society thinks it's okay to have concubines, you have concubines. Society thinks it's okay to slap your slave if he doesn't move fast enough, you slap your slave. What Socrates is saying is you have to be virtuous even if no one knows and regardless of what anyone thinks. Because your soul is what you're making good by being virtuous, or you're harming your soul by being vicious. So that's very important. Raise the problem of suffering, right? It's just day after day after day of misery. People are getting killed. People are getting injured. Not on top of that, they're fighting with each other. It's just horrible. So it's basically a tragedy, the Iliad. It ends with a funeral, right? The way you distinguish comedy and tragedy in terms of literature is that comedy ends with a wedding. A tragedy ends with a funeral. Well, it ends with Hector's funeral. You know, it's tragic. It's horrible. The poor guy. You know, the poor wife and children, and so on and so forth. Right? So it's the problem. It says the problem of evil, right? The first text of Western civilization is dealing with the problem of human suffering. And then part of why the gods and goddesses are so capricious is because that's the explanation. Like, you know, I don't know, like someone's riding their chariot, the chariot breaks and they get killed. They break their neck and they die, right? Well, God must have been ticked off at them. And the gods are capricious. They're moody. And Zeus was having a bad day, so he, you see what I mean? That's they're trying to make sense for how things happen seemingly without it making any sense. I think we're just out of time, but yeah.
I was just going to say that was a good example from Zeus. He's kind of like on the side of the Trojans, and by the end he's like, well, if they're on their own now, so I got to...
Right, so if they're losing now, must have Zeus changed his mind. So why are things happening? They're trying to ascribe it to one of there being many gods. Okay, that's good. So next time we'll just pick up where we left off there with the Odyssey. Yeah, maybe why don't you start bringing the pre-Socratic book too for next time? So bring the mythology and the pre-Socratics because we're going to start to segue into the pre-Socratic stuff.